Story. My name's Tegan Maleen.
My name is Melanie Nevis.
And today we are diving even deeper into Celtic lore and Celtic tales. And today we're going to visit a topic that, I think it's probably I want to call it the gateway drug to Celtic lore. Because at least for me it was.
We've talked about it already because we did do an episode where we kind of went into fairies a little bit, but I feel like it warrants another.
Yeah. Well, fairies is just such a vast topic. And I think, there's several ideas of what a fairy is. There's the initial onset idea, probably, of what children grow up with, that they're like little kind of sprites or little, tiny little beings of light, and they're just cute. And they have these cute wings, and they drink tea on toadstools.
That's, I think, what we are taught to think of when we think of fairies, right? We're taught to think of them as like really nice Tinkerbell type figures with cute wings and like little pixie cuts,
Yeah. And then if you ever get interested enough in fairies to like explore a bit, like even just a little bit deeper in, you find out quite quickly that A, they don't look like that. B, if they do, there's a reason for it. It's not good.
Yeah.
And C, they're kind of like mischievous, depending on who you're asking, assholes.
They're very much like people, There's some that are really good and helpful,
Maybe worse
and
sometimes.
others that are jerks. And I think that maybe is part of the allure with them. Like they can grant you a bunch of things and help you, but you never really know which way they're going to go.
Yeah. And there's such a wide range, like, because even though technically fairies often get tied to Celtic stuff, in general, there's fairies, there's dwarves, there's gnomes. Sometimes they're one and the same. Sometimes they're different. Sometimes they live amongst each other. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes one tradition has one type and another tradition has others. And it really becomes like a geographical, like it really becomes connected to the culture of the place, and becomes more, what's the word, just more defined based on where it is and the people that are there and the things that have happened there historically, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. And there are similarities with Scottish versus Welsh versus English versus whatever,
like all
fairies.
things, there's crossover. Yeah,
there's crossover, and then there are some that are actually quite unique to the place, like you're saying.
Yeah. So we're going to explore some of that today. And where should we start? Should we start with the Scottish tales, maybe? Because it's like something that
sure.
people know a bit more. Well, maybe not. Well, I mean, what I know about Scotland is they do have fairies, and there's kind of like a caution sign attached to the whole situation.
Yes, yeah. Scottish fairies, they definitely do play a very prominent and important role in Scottish folklore, from waterways and lochs to like each of these things would have an ancient fairy to protect it, and there are important rituals believed to be responsible for like failing crops or when someone has violated and upset them, that involve fairy kind. Sorry, I've got a cat on me.
We both have our cats are so into this season.
It's crazy.
Even the last episode we did, they were all over us, both of them.
I know.
Maybe it's probably the fairies. They're riding them, and they're like, "Go bug these
They're
girls."
into the fairies. It's so funny.
That's
So the point of the story, or like the short end of the story for this, is like before you go like walking into fields and forests by yourself, just educate yourself on the different fairies and their significance. The first rule in Scotland is to never let a fairy overhear you calling them fairies. They don't take kindly to it, apparently. They prefer to be called just fair folk, and they are fairly sensitive creatures. So don't be rude or you might suffer the consequences.
I can't get over Calypso's face. It's like right in the camera. Oh my god. These be the consequences.
Oh, Jesus, Calypso. Oh,
This is the
God.
funniest thing ever. Like the amount of chaos that is going on behind the scenes of this recording is like something that has never happened before, and it's both like it's cats. It's all the cats, and I know that they're like the demon spawn of the fairy, like the fair people. They're they're
Oh my gosh,
tigers.
it's so funny. Good job, Calypso.
That was the cutest thing ever, though.
Their face right up there.
I love how
She
involved
always
you guys
does.
are.
I think she gets really upset when she can hear me talking but can't hear the person on the other end because she's like, are you talking to me? What can I do for you?
Yeah, same with Izzy. Lena used to be like that too. Oh man, the minute I would get on a call with anybody, she'd be like right up in my grill. Like all of a sudden, like the lights turned on or something.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Back to fairies. So always be honest with a fairy because they will know if you've lied to them.
Mm,
And they don't take very kindly to that either. Surprise, surprise.
hmm.
Also, don't wear the color green because that's seen as a color that belongs to them.
Oops. Well, not me, just living in green all the time.
I mean, but this is in Scotland. This is specific to Scottish fairies, apparently.
Okay.
That said, they're not all impatient. So, like, not all fairies are impatient when it comes to humans. They don't all need to be avoided by us. Like, they're that balance that I was talking about. Like humans, there are good humans and bad humans. It's the same thing with fairies. There's a balance between good and evil.
Okay.
And there's a lot of different types of fairies and what encompasses fairies, like you talked about. So in Scotland, there's fair folk that live in bodies of water that might be selkies, or you have brownies, pixies. They've got like the Sealy courts.
Hmm.
So lots of different magical experiences and beings and magical realms. And most of these kinds of fairies are mischievous, yes, but they can be friendly. There are others that really dislike humans quite intensely.
Fair enough.
And actually, kelpies kind of fall into that categories
Did you say
of like
kelpies?
kelpies, yeah.
Okay.
They tend to fall into the category of disliking humans quite intensely. And
Hmm.
so if you do have an encounter with certain fae folk, and I have a bunch of other names here, but honestly, I don't know how to pronounce them. So I'm not going to try. I apologize. Um, they could end really badly for you. I encourage you to do your research before you go to Scotland to see what lies before you. And so you can actually name things properly, or at least try to. Some will fool you with comical antics, some where it will lure you with beauty, which we've kind of talked about that one a lot because fair
I'll talk
folk
about that a
tend to
lot more
be,
later too.
yeah, they tend to be really
Fair.
beautiful if they are trying to lure humans in.
Hmm.
And others will kind of just let you know how they feel about human intrusion because, like it or not, us just going into the wilderness is an intrusion, even though we like to do it.
I mean, Fern Gully, man, I kind of understand it. I get it. Like humans as a species are kind of shit, and like every now and then
Hmm.
there's some decent ones.
Yeah.
So, I mean, fairies have been around long enough to know. I mean, a lot of the
Yeah.
time these days when I read these stories, I'm like, meh, makes sense. You know?
Yeah. Right. But in general, fairies are pretty private and they see any invasion of privacy or space as an act that can be avenged by taking away a human's sight or bringing illness or destroying crops. And so stick to a couple of rules, like respect the fairies and don't make anyone upset, like don't enrage them and don't call them fairies, call them fair folk and things like that. You should be safe on the plains of Scotland.
How do you
That's
not
the
enrage
general
them
thing with
though?
Scottish. Hmm?
How do you not enrage them though? Like, because I know that some fairies are like kind of mischievous and like things that we would think are fine, it's not fine for them, or things that they would think are fine are not fine for us. So it's like, how do you? It's
I
almost
think you
like
have to do
dealing
your
with a
research
bear.
to figure out what area you're going into and figure out what type of fairies dwell there so that you can know what you're getting into.
always go into the forest with a thimble of honey water, or honey wine, or both,
I don't know.
because
I mean, like in Newfoundland, it's you go in, but you have to have either stones or pieces of bread in your pocket, and it'll
oh
keep the
right,
fairies away.
right. I know that they love that though. I know that they love honey water. Just as a side note, guys,
Yeah.
it's probably a safe bet. Always giving
Who
them something
doesn't
to
love
drink.
honey water?
Who doesn't want something to drink? You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, a little sweet something to drink. So, the first story I have from my Celtic Tales book is called The Seal Catcher and the Selkies. So, once upon a time, there was a man who lived not far from the very north of Scotland. He dwelled in a little cottage by the seashore, and he made his living by catching seals and selling their fur. He earned a good deal of money in this way, for these creatures used to come out of the sea in large numbers and lie on the rocks near his house, basking in the sunshine, so that it was not difficult to creep up behind them and kill them.
Oh God.
Now, some of those seals were larger than others, and the country people used to call them selkies and whisper that they were not seals at all, but mermen and merwomen who came from a country of their own far down under the ocean, and who assumed this strange disguise in order to pass through the water and come up to breathe the air of this earth of ours. But the seal catcher only laughed, and he said that those seals were the ones most worth killing, for their skins were so big that he got paid an extra price for them. Now, it chanced one day, as he crept and stabbed one of those particularly large seals with his hunting knife, that the creature gave a loud cry of pain and slipped off the rock into the sea. It disappeared under the water, carrying the knife along with it, and the seal catcher, much annoyed at his clumsiness and also at the loss of his knife, went home to dinner in a very downcast frame of mind. On his way
Hmm.
home, he met a horseman who was so tall and strange looking, and who rode on such a gigantic horse that the seal catcher stopped and looked at him in astonishment, wondering who he was and what country he came from. The stranger stopped as well and asked him his trade. On hearing that he was a seal catcher, he immediately ordered a great number of seal skins, and the seal catcher was delighted, for such an order meant a large sum of money to him.
Hmm.
But his face fell when the horseman added that it was absolutely necessary that the skins should be delivered that evening. I cannot do it, the seal catcher said in a disappointed voice.
Good
No, I
job.
can't do Scottish accents.
It was not bad. It wasn't bad.
I can't do Scottish accents. um, I can't do it, for the seals will not come back to the rocks again until tomorrow morning. Well, I can take you to the place where there are any number of seals, answered the stranger, if you will mount behind me on my horse and come with me. So the seal catcher agreed to this and climbed up behind the rider, and then the rider shook his bridle rein, and off the great horse galloped at such a pace that the seal catcher had much ado to keep on his seat. On and on they went, flying like the wind, until at last they came to the edge of a huge precipice, the face of which went sheer down to the sea. Here the mysterious horseman pulled up his steed with a jerk. Get off now, he said shortly. The seal catcher did as he was bid, and when he found himself safe on the ground, he peeped cautiously over the edge of the cliff to see if there were any seals lying on the rocks below. To his astonishment, he saw no rocks, only the blue sea, which came right to the foot of the cliff. um, where are the seals that you spoke of? He asked anxiously, wishing that he had never set out on such a rash adventure. You will see presently, answered the stranger, who was attending to his horse's bridle. The seal catcher was now thoroughly frightened, for he felt sure that some evil was about to befall him, and in such a lonely place, he knew it would be useless to cry out for help.
Uh-oh.
And it seemed as if his fears would prove only too true, for the moment the stranger's hand was laid upon his shoulder, and he felt himself being hurled bodily over the cliff, and then he fell with a splash into the sea. He thought his last hour had come, and he wondered how anyone could work such a deed of wrong upon an innocent man. But, to
Innocent.
his astonishment, he found that some change must have passed over him, for instead of being choked by the water, he could breathe quite easily. He and his companion, who was still close at his side, seemed to be sinking as quickly down through the sea as they had flown through the air. Down and down they went until he couldn't tell how far. And at last, they came to a huge arched door, which appeared to be made of pink coral, studded over with cockle shells. And it opened of its own accord. And then they entered and found themselves in a huge hall with the walls, which were formed of mother of pearl, and the floor was made of sea sand, smooth, firm, and yellow.
Cool.
And the hall was crowded with occupants, but they were seals, not men. And when the seal catcher turned to his companion to ask him what it all meant, he was aghast to find that the rider, too, had assumed the form of a seal. He was still more aghast when he caught sight of himself in the large mirror that hung on the wall and saw that he also was no longer a man, but had transformed into a nice hairy brown seal. Oh, woe to me! For no fault of my own, this artful stranger has laid upon some baneful charm upon me, and in this awful guise I will remain for the rest of my life.
Typical.
At first, none of the huge creatures spoke to him. For some reason or another, they seemed to be very sad. They moved gently about the hall, talking quietly and mournfully to one another, or lay sadly upon the sandy floor, wiping big tears from their eyes with their soft, furry fins. But presently they began to notice him and to whisper to one another. Then his guide moved away from him and disappeared through the door at the end of the hall. When he returned, he held a huge knife in his hand.
Oh.
Did you ever see this before? He asked, holding it out to the unfortunate seal catcher, who, to his horror, recognized his own hunting knife with which he had stuck the seal in the morning,
Knew it. Yeah.
and which had been carried off by the wounded animal. At the sight of the knife, he fell upon his face and begged for mercy, for once he came to the conclusion that the inhabitants of the cavern, enraged at the harm which had been wrought upon their comrade, had contrived to capture him and to bring him down to their subterranean abode in order to wreak their vengeance upon him by killing him. But instead of doing so, they crowded round him, rubbing their soft noses against his fur to show their sympathy, and implored him not to put himself about, for no harm will befall him, and they would love him all their lives if he would only do what they asked him. Well, tell me what it is, said the seal catcher, and I will do it if it lies within my power. Follow me, answered his guide, and he led the way through the door which had disappeared, and he went to seek the knife. So the seal catcher followed him, and there in a smaller room he found the great brown seal lying on a bed of pale pink seaweed, with a gaping wound in his side. That is my father, said his guide, whom
Oh,
you wounded
snap.
this morning, thinking that he was one of the common seals who live in the sea, instead of a merman who has speech and understanding as you mortals have. I brought you hither to bind up his wounds, for no other hand than yours can heal him. I have no skill in the art of healing, said the seal catcher, who, astonished at the forbearance of these strange creatures whom he had so unwittingly wronged. But I will bind up the wound to the best of my power, and I am only sorry that it was my hands that caused it. So he went over to the bed and, stooping over the wounded seal, washed and dressed the hurt as well as he could. And the touch of his hands appeared to work like magic, for no sooner had he finished than the wound seemed to deaden and die, leaving only the scar, and the old seal sprang up as well as ever. Then there was a great rejoicing throughout the whole palace of the seals. They laughed and they talked and they embraced each other in their own strange way, crowding around their comrade and rubbing their noses against his, as if to show him how delighted they were at his recovery. But all this while the seal catcher stood alone in a corner, his mind filled with dark thoughts. For although he saw now that they had no intention of killing him, he didn't exactly relish the prospect of spending the rest of his life in the guise of a seal, fathoms deep under the ocean. But presently his guide approached him and said, "Now you are at liberty to return to your home, to your wife and your children. I will take you to them, but only on one condition." "Well, what's that?" asked the seal catcher eagerly, overjoyed at the prospect of being restored safely to the upper world and to his family. That you will take a solemn oath never to wound a seal again.
Mhm.
That will I do right gladly, he replied, for although the promise meant giving up his means of livelihood, he felt that if only he regained his proper shape, he could always turn his hand to something else. So he took the required oath with all due solemnity, holding up his fin as he swore, and all of the other seals crowded round him as witnesses. And a sigh of relief went through the halls when his words were spoken, for he was the most noted seal catcher in the north of Scotland.
Ah.
Then he bade the stranger company farewell, and accompanied by his guide, passed once more through the outer doors of coral and up and up and up through the shadowy green water until it began to grow lighter and lighter, and at last they emerged into the sunshine. And then, with one spring, they reached up to the top of the cliff, where the great black horse was waiting for them, quietly nibbling the green turf. When they left the water, their strange guise dropped from them, and they were now as they had been before, a plain seal catcher and a tall, well-dressed gentleman riding in clothes. In riding clothes. Uh,
I was like, yeah, riding in clothes. Yep.
Get up behind me, said the latter, as he swung himself into the saddle, and the seal catcher did as he was bid, taking tight hold of his companion's coat, for he remembered how nearly he had fallen off on his previous journey. Then it all happened as it happened before. The bridle was shaken, the horse galloped off, and it was not long before the seal catcher found himself standing in the safety of his own garden gate. He held out his hand to say goodbye, but as he did so, the stranger pulled out a huge bag of gold and placed it in his hand.
Oh, damn.
You've done your part of the bargain, and we must do ours. Men shall never say that we took away an honest man's work without making reparation for it. And here is what will keep you in comfort until your life's end. And then he rode away, and when the astonished seal catcher carried the bag back into his cottage and turned the gold out onto the table, he found what the stranger had said to be true, and that he would be a rich man for the remainder of his days.
Wow, that really worked out in his favor.
I know, right?
Like
Considering he was killing them.
you don't hear many stories like that. But I think it's
No.
interesting. I think it's interesting because, I think we have a tendency to kind of divide the idea of like a mermaid, a selkie, and fairies. But it's true that, especially like in Celtic lore, they're all fantastical fairy like beings. And there's so much water lore. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
so much lore connected to like things, to like an entire world under the ocean or under in the sea, or you know what I mean?
There's just like there's different types, right? Like there's different types of people, there's different types of animals. They're all categorized, like all cats are categorized as cats, but then you divide them further into the domestic house cat, a lion, a tiger, whatever, you know?
Yeah, but I guess that's what I mean. I think that
Yeah.
like I wouldn't necessarily like before now I wouldn't have necessarily thought as of a mermaid or a selkie as a fairy, but in fact, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all part of the fairy like lore because they're these magical creatures. And even in some,
Yeah.
we talked a little bit about like these things in one of our other episodes too, but even there are beings who are like born of the gods and like live in the other world, and they're also like fairy like beings, creatures as well.
Yeah. And maybe I'm not sure if that's just for
No, I think
Scottish
it's pretty across
lore.
the board. Yeah. Because
Yeah. Okay.
I was reading my book called Classic Celtic Fairy Tales. I was reading it for the last couple days, and I was reading a bunch of different stories from like Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and like it was similar in all of them,
Mm-hmm.
where these things are, they're not exactly what we would think of typically as fairies, but they are
Yeah.
they're magical creatures. You know what I mean? That are in
Yeah.
that is part of fairy lore. And I think it's interesting because where we get into what we would typically think of a fairy is usually where we get into like the scary fairies, as I like to call them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but they're not always like, they're mischievous, sure, but they're not all doom and gloom. They're not all always evil. They like to pull pranks.
I
Like, it's
don't even
entertainment for
I don't
them.
even believe the full stories of them being evil, because I think that's a very like Christianized kind of idea. And
Yeah.
it's really interesting because when we had talked about doing this episode, you were like, "Oh, you should look at see if there's some fairy lore in Brittany." And it was a really good suggestion because we mentioned in the first episode that Brittany in France is a part of like the Celtic, not the Celtic Isle, but yeah, like kind of the Celtic Isle. It's really interesting because there's a part of France that has a very big Celtic history. There's a part of Spain that has a Celtic history, and it all runs along that same coast.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that would be a good idea. And as I was looking, first of all, I've heard a lot about Brittany since I've been here, for multiple reasons. My husband's grandfather that just passed away, he was a sailor, so
Oh, cool.
he
I
was
didn't
like
know he
a
was a sailor.
yeah, he was. And the culture in Brittany is very much a sailor's culture. So there's like
Mm-hmm.
songs of the sea. It's very similar to like what we would hear on the other side, like on the East Coast from where we're from. There's a lot of that
Mm-hmm.
similar shared energy. Brittany is kind of famous for like lots of rain and ocean,
Yeah. Okay.
and
Fair.
everything revolves around the sea out there. So it was interesting, in looking into this lore a little bit. I was also finding a lot of stuff about mermaids and selkies and things like that, even in the French lore.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to kind of see, in the research, I kind of wanted to see what the most popular lore for Brittany was. And so, like, for context for anybody that's wondering, if you look on a map of France and you look at the French west coast, you'll see like towards the north, you'll see La Rochelle and Nantes, and then you'll see this part of France that just jets out further than any other part. And
Mm-hmm.
just above that, because you're looking on a map and obviously distance isn't real on a map, but just above that, you'll see
Mm-hmm.
the British Isles. And
Yeah.
then the coast kind of jets back in and goes into like the northern part of France. So Brittany is this part that like kind of jets out on the west
Yeah.
coast of France there. And it's really interesting because it has a very Celtic identity that they still keep intact to this day. There are even,
Mm-hmm.
I was watching a video earlier of dance troops, like Celtic Britain dance troops that actually go around
Okay.
and compete, like the way that like the Irish dance troops would, or something like that. Like
Oh, fun.
yeah, they maintain their music culture, they maintain like their dance culture, and a part of that is also their like folkloric culture as well, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, so I wanted to explore that a little bit. But before I get into like the actual fairy core of it, I want to give an honorable mention to the thing that is in the Breton folkloric tradition. The most famous place is a forest known as the forest of, let's see, I have to think with my French brain. Hold on. Brocelion. Brocelion. I hope I'm
So
saying that
is it
right.
like the Brosseland Forest?
It is that, but French
Okay.
pronounced. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
so there is a whole, so you know of this. So you know where I'm going with this. It's important to talk about it because it is like the most famous part of like the fairy folkloric tradition in Breton. But
Mm-hmm.
it's also important to talk about because we've actually touched on the topic of it briefly before in other seasons of the podcast. So, first and foremost, what makes this forest interesting is that it's associated with all of the Arthurian legends. And if you haven't listened to our season on Arthurian legends, shameless plug, it's the one before this one. Go listen to it. It's really cool. So it's supposed to be the forest where Merlin retires, where he's inevitably imprisoned, and where he dies slash is trapped to this very day.
So
And
sad. If it's
yeah, it's also said to be the forest where Morgaine and Vivian in the early Arthurian legends, they are fairies. And
mm-hmm.
Morgaine is supposed to trap men in this forest, like unfaithful men. And she does all this stuff until Lancelot comes along and thwarts her plans. So that's all
Mm-hmm.
supposed to happen in this forest. What's really interesting is that it is a real physical place, and that is a bit of a trick because in the stories, it's often described for its attributes as opposed to the physical location. So it's taken like many years of debate between smart men to determine where it actually was. But they have like actually said it's this place in Brittany, and you can actually Google. You can like go on Google right now and Google the name and Google like what did you how did you say it in English?
The Brosseland Forest. You can
Okay.
literally Google Brosseland Forest, and then it'll pull up with the French stuff.
Yeah. So they actually declare the forest there as this forest. And it's in a department where everything around it is named for it as a result. And that part of Brittany has like a really, really strong culture of trying to keep the stories alive. So they have lots of events that you can go through where you can go like into the forest and recount the tales of the Arthurian legends or recount tales
Aw.
of fairies and things like that. So that is like a huge part of the folkloric tradition. So it's important to mention it. It's also associated with the fairies that we are going to be talking about. Because when I was looking into the fairies, of course, like I said, there was mermaids, there were selkies, but what is mostly known as a fairy in Brittany is something known as a corrigan. Have you heard of that before?
I don't think so.
Okay. So there's a few things. First of all, there's the corrigans, which we're going to dive a little bit deeper into them, but there's also the this other type of mischievous character called les lutins or the lutins, if you
Mm-hmm.
want to. And the lutins are like they're kind of what we're talking about earlier. They call themselves giants, though nobody's ever seen them big. They like to do things like kick bikes or like kick people while they're riding bikes. So if you're on a road and you randomly fall off your bike, it's a lutin like messing with you.
Okay.
And they say that you can tell that they're present because of the way that all of the rocks and standing stones that are out in Brittany get like put across the land because they're sitting there being mischievous, rolling these rocks all into these random places.
It sounds kind of like a hobgoblin.
It is. I was just gonna
Oh,
say,
okay.
I think that we know them mostly as hobgoblins.
Okay.
That's what the
Okay.
lutin is. So they're
It's the rocks. It's the rocks that tipped me off of like
yeah,
rolling stones in the field. I'm like, that sounds like a hobgoblin.
yeah. So I mean, they're not bad, but they're not nice. They're kind of naughty in a like haha kind of way. But the Corrigans, on the other hand, are not to be messed with in any way, shape, or form. The
Okay.
Corrigans, I think, have maybe gotten a bit of a bad rap over time, and I will explain why. So, the Corrigans, this is what we know of them. They are often described as tiny creatures, no bigger than a thumb, who can usually be seen near fountains wells, sorry, in dusk at the time of dusk, so around sunset or in the evening. This is
Okay.
important to note because just like we've seen in so many other things, these are the Korrigans are
Liminal times.
they're considered like sirens of water on land.
Well, because sirens are land dwellers.
Are they?
Sirens are not mermaids. We went over this before when we talked about mermaids at one point.
Oh
Sirens in
yeah.
Greek mythology traditionally have wings and they would live on
Right.
islands,
Right.
but they are like on land
So
near water.
so similarly, These are very, very tiny creatures, but they specifically like to hang out near wells and fountains.
Okay.
And they have a very bad reputation, like you were mentioning earlier. And it's pretty much overall advised that people, no matter who you are, you keep your distance. You do not want to fuck with them because their ultimate motivation is to kill men. Now,
Oh, cool.
yeah. So some people kind of say that they are a fairy or more like a dwarf like creature. Like you can see some pictures of them where they look more like what we would think of as like a gnome or something. And then some of
Okay.
them say they're more of like, but a lot more tend to lean to this siren-esque, beautiful, tiny little creature that a man could never look away from. So, like I said, their motivation, first of all, is to sleep with and kill men. Very also similar to like the stories of sirens, right?
Yeah.
And it's important to get that out of the way. Men are said to be unable to resist their beauty. So if you're a man, you're basically screwed. They'll lure you in, they'll sleep with you, and then as they're sleeping with you, they will kill you with their breath.
With their breath.
Yeah, they have their breath kills.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if that means
Okay.
they breathe on them and they die or they just suck the breath out of the man. I'm assuming they suck the breath out of the man.
Oh.
But they, apparently
Yeah,
they have
because I
toxic breath.
imagine like, yeah, I don't know that you could like all over someone's body and that calls
Ah,
them in.
I
I feel
never
like sucking their soul makes more sense.
I never put it past a fairy, but you know, yeah, I
Yeah.
get what you're saying. So, like I said, they're heavily associated with water. And they're also heavily associated with the time of dusk when the light kind of starts to play tricks.
Mm-hmm.
You'll often find, like, if you're going to see one, you'll often see one sitting by a well or a fountain, combing their long, beautiful golden hair in the reflection.
Always.
Yes.
Always.
And they're, though they are said to be seen as very beautiful, by the day, their eyes are red and their hair is white and their skin is wrinkled. So they had tried to be avoid being seen by the daylight. So they look kind of like a mole rat during the day, and then at night, a bald one, and then at night they look like these beautiful, fantastical creatures. I just think these guys were drunk. You know what I mean?
You know,
Like,
like when I was little and PJ Pets was a thing, I remember going one day and they had a naked mole rat for some reason. And I like walked over to it and it was taking a shit. And for some reason, that memory is still like so strong in my brain
oh my
every time I
god.
hear naked mole rat.
Well,
Okay,
I
continue.
mean, I think it fits. It sounds like it fits. You know what I mean? These guys think they're getting lured in by like pretty little fairies. They're just drunk guys that are getting that see a mole rat and they're like turned on by it and then it bites them and kills
Oh my
them. Like, oh
gosh.
my god. Anyway,
It's
the
so funny that it has like no hair during the day. And then in its fairy form, the
It has
alopecia is
hair.
gone.
It has hair on its head, but it's like white.
Okay.
It just the
Oh, okay.
skin is all like shriveled up and
All
wrinkly, and
wrinkled.
they have.
Okay.
Actually, I think I really feel like they did a rendition of this in oh, what's that show? True Blood with the fairies. I think they did this in that show, if I remember correctly. Because
I
during the
watched some
day,
of True Blood, not all.
yeah, well, the later seasons are when they get into the fairies, and yeah, that's anyway. So if you watched it, you watched it. If you didn't, it's not such a big deal. But I think that they do that where they show them during the day, and they're like, "Yikes!"
Oh
But
dear. Okay.
it's important to know that the Korgans have like a special relationship with religion, Christianity in particular, and
Of course.
that special relationship is that they absolutely hate it, and they hate everything to
Yes.
do with it. They are said to have led the resistance against the conversion of Christianity when the apostles
Hmm.
first arrived out, like in the Brittany region.
Okay.
Because of
That's kind of
this,
cool.
yeah, but this part's a bit interesting. Because of this,
Yeah.
they're also said to hate the Virgin Mary, and that whole legend takes two layers. First of all, it's said that the Virgin Mary actually chased all the Corrigan away from the fountains and the wells. So the Virgin Mary came and, like, or the spirit of the Virgin Mary came and kind
She
of
had
just
nothing
like,
better to do, apparently. Okay.
well, it's really interesting because in France, water is always associated to Mary. And
Yeah.
there are tons of places, even where I live, where you find a well or a spring, and that's where the Virgin Mary was seen. And you always know that there's some, like, underneath, there's got to be some other stories of something else.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that this was really interesting that that could actually be part of the lore.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, Saturdays are supposed to be the favorite days of the Corrigan. That's when they get into the most trouble, and that's when they kill the most dudes. So that on Saturdays, especially Saturday night,
Yeah,
and
when
the air is
everybody's
getting
out
hot.
drinking.
Yeah, this is when you have to be very careful not to go near a fountain or a well. But
Okay, what
apparently,
if you just want water?
oh,
What if you just don't want to drink alcohol?
we'll get to it. Yeah, no,
Okay.
that wasn't a. Are you kidding me, girl? That was not allowed in France for a long time. Alcohol,
I know.
alcohol. Oh,
Alcohol is water. Well, I mean, for a long time, alcohol was healthier than water because
yeah.
water you could get sick from it
I was just gonna
a
say,
lot of the time.
one day we'll tell the story of Saint Arnold, who is like the patron saint of beer
Nice.
in Belgium in the north of France, because of what you just said. He's the one that figured out
Mm-hmm.
that beer would be better to drink than water.
Yeah, beer
Anyways,
was safer.
so now, it's interesting because Saturday is supposed to be the Corrigan's favorite day of, like, getting into trouble. Now in that area, I don't know if it's all of France or just in that area, but Saturday masses are often dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So she's like their
Mm.
public enemy number one. They don't really like her at all, and they don't want to mess with her. They're also associated with Samhain, being said to
Oh,
dwell around dolmens and standing stones, waiting for victims at that time of year. So you know what like the dolmens are,
yeah,
like those
yeah.
old huts,
They're like old ancient burial tomb structures,
which we
basically.
have like buttloads of them. All, like, there's tons of them
Yeah,
all over France. So apparently on Halloween they hang out there waiting for people. Now, it's
cool.
important to note, in general, you do not want to come across a Corrigan. They're unpredictable, and they could very well predict your future. They could change shape, or they could move at lightning speed, just as much as they could put a curse on you, kill you with their breath, or swap your baby with an ugly changeling baby. There's like,
Uh-oh.
yeah, there's tons of stories and accounts of this, of them doing all of these things. So in general, people
Honestly,
are advised to stay away.
I think that changelings, like this idea of changelings, probably only came about a lot later
Yeah.
when people would have kids with disabilities that they didn't understand. Like if you had a child who was autistic
Yeah.
or had ADHD or something like that, that
Very
child would
visible
be
deformities,
misunderstood. That's
probably.
what, yeah, that's kind of what I think changelings are like the myth of changelings come from because it was just so not understood.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. But obviously these fair folk seem like the perfect scapegoats, right? For
Yeah, absolutely.
all of these things. So
For sure.
obviously we know now their primary motive is to kill men, but because they say that no man can resist. But there is at least one story I could find of, like, a man that actually did resist. So the
Hmm.
question is, what if a man could resist? What would happen? And so we have a story here called Le Seigneur de Nan, which is the Lord of Nan. So this is the story about the Lord of Nan. The Lord of Nun was married to a woman who he deeply, deeply loved. One day, upon his wife's request, he went on a ride to gather May blossoms. As his journey went on and on, he became tired and thirsty. So when he came across a fountain, he decided to take a drink.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. It was here that the Lord came across a beautiful Corrigan combing her long blonde hair. When she caught sight of the Lord, she started to entice him, using her charms to lure him into sleeping with her. But the Lord was so deeply dedicated to his wife that he angrily refused and quickly rode away. But as he rode away, he could hear the Corrigan saying that his fate was already sealed and that he would soon die. The
Hmm.
Lord rode fast, but even as he did, he started to feel weaker and weaker, even as he drew closer and closer to home. When he arrived, he said to his mother, "My good mother, if you love me, make my bed. I am sick unto death. Say not a word to my bride, for within 3 days I shall be laid in the grave. A Corrigan has done me evil." As
Aw.
requested, the curse was kept secret from his wife for 3 days until he died. When the Lord's mother finally told her daughter in law the truth, the wife also died of a broken heart and was buried beside her husband. And that is the
Aw.
story of the Lord of Nam. It's really sad. There's no
So you're
way
damned
out.
if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, which especially when you're a dude, you're damned either way. So the whole thing is just to avoid at all costs because
I know, but if you're dying of thirst,
yeah.
you're like, what do I have to lose? You're gonna
Right,
die
you're
no
gonna
matter
die
what.
either way, right? Yeah.
Might as well satiate the thirst.
Well, I don't know that he was dying of thirst so much as he was just thirsty. Like he was only
Yeah.
going out collecting flowers. You know what I mean? It's not like he was not on a quest or anything like that. But actually,
That's fair.
speaking of that, there are also known stories of Corgans working with the light, the way that the light plays tricks on your eyes at dusk. And they will also do things like they'll find a well or a fountain that's like around, or like a body of water that's not around much, and they can actually
Mhm.
shift it and make it into like an oasis style forest or like a grand
Ooh.
castle. And then they just sit inside and they wait for somebody who is on a long voyage, like a weary traveler
Yeah.
or something, to come in and seek some refuge. And then they fuck that guy and kill him too.
Damn.
Yeah. And so
Okay. Well,
that is the stories
these are
of
the
the
ones,
Corrigan.
again, you want to figure out where you're going and what
Yeah.
lives there so you have an understanding of what you're getting into.
How to proceed. Yes.
How to proceed. Always proceed with caution, but
But I
you
found this
know,
very interesting, and I also like don't know if I believe all of it because it's very Christianized, I think. And I
yeah,
think
for sure.
I like I said, I couldn't find many actual stories where they told the actual stories. They just like listed references to the stories on the internet, but this really like inspired me to like want to learn more about the Corrigan just because I think it's kind of interesting. Like there's definitely similarities that we see from other fairy stories from like Scotland and
Hmm.
Ireland and all and Wales, but I would love to like do a deep dive and actually read a bit more of the stories from them.
Okay, I will say that not all hobgoblins are bad though. Like in Scottish
The
fairy
Corrigan are not
tales,
the same
they're
as the hobgoblins. The
oh
the
yeah, the hobgoblin. Sorry, you're right, you're
the
right, you're right.
Lutins are the hobgoblins, and they're like
Right.
just kind of like
They're fine.
they're
Yeah,
grumpy
yeah,
old
yeah.
brats. You know what I mean? They're grumpy brats.
Yeah.
But the
Okay.
Corrigan are really marked as these like well sirens
Yeah, and
because
sirens just have
men needed to
that
find an
reputation
excuse
for
as to
being
why they were all drowning in fountains. Facts. Tell me I'm wrong.
Oh, it's so funny. But if you're interested in these Celtic fairies, there's also Mara Starling, I think on YouTube, has a video
Oh, she's
that breaks
fantastic.
down, yeah, that breaks down Celtic fairies as well, that you can go and take a look at that. And she basically breaks them down into like two types, which are corporeal, which we see, they look like humans, they kind of disguise themselves as humans, and then ethereal. So those are more
Hmm.
the spirity elves that have like different traits and powers and like super powers almost that could like zap from one place to another. Whereas like, yeah, the corporeal ones are very much, they like to interact with humans and mix with them, sometimes mate with them, and like bestow blessings on people that they deem worthy and things like that. So if you're interested in Celtic fairies, take a look at some of Mara Starling's stuff, I think.
And also, because we are big, obviously, we're big Mara Starling fans. We just mentioned her in the last episode and in this episode too. But this is a good time to. Oh my gosh, my cat is sleeping with her eyes open and I can see them moving. That is holy crap.
Creepy.
Sorry. Anyways, yes, because we love Mara Starling, we mentioned her in the last episode and in this episode too, but this is the perfect segue to plug her book that is going to be coming out sometime this year. That's all about Celtic or like Welsh fairies. I think she's doing a whole book on Welsh fairies. She also has a book on Welsh witchcraft, which I think I mentioned in the last podcast, which I have read and I love. But yeah, she's going to release a new book on that too. So double check that out. I'm gonna buy it. Yeah. I'm buying it. Like
I know. Yeah, but it is really interesting because she's able to kind of go into depth because she lives and breathes this stuff basically.
Yeah,
which is really neat.
Quite literally lives it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is cool. So I think that's all we really have
I was
time
just about
for.
To say.
I know you had another story. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think that is all that we have time for, but there are lots of stories.
There are plenty. So why don't you tell them the book that you have there?
Okay, so it's literally called Celtic Tales, Fairy Tales and Stories of Enchantment from Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, and Wales. There's no author, but the illustrations are by someone named Kate Foster, and the illustrations are really beautiful.
Okay, see?
Yeah.
Ooh, pretty. So I have a book as well called Classic Celtic Fairy Tales. It's an old book though, so I've had that book since I was 13. It was published in like 1999 or something like this. I can't remember who.
I mean, it's not that old.
It's not that old, except it was before I went into high school, and I'm almost 40. So I mean, it's not that old, but like we're older than we realize. I think at this point in the game. It's because we're supposed to be adults, but nobody really feels like one.
No one is an adult. Not even adults are adults.
That's not a real thing.
No.
Adults aren't real, guys. FYI. You don't believe us, just ask the fairies. Anyways, come back and join us for we have one more episode in this season. And so we would love for you guys to give it a listen and check it out. You can find us on Instagram at the Allegory Story Podcast. You can send us an email at the Allegory Story Podcast at gmail.com. This is where we be being on the internet.
That's all for today. We will see you next time.
Bye. Do your research.